The whole climate alarm, all of it, is based on the assertion that emissions of carbon dioxide from industry are causing the Earth's climate to change. Is it true? My name is Martin Durkin, and this is the Guerrilla Science Guide to CO2.
Carbon dioxide. It's at the heart of our climate crisis.
CO2 is rising and is at scary levels.
Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere hit a record high last month.
The trend in CO2 levels is way up.
It's causing temperatures to rise, and in the process causing all sorts of climate chaos.
Extreme storms, hotter seasons.
There's more flooding, there's more hurricanes.
All the data says so, and so does the basic physics.
An increased amount of carbon dioxide in the air directly contributes to global warming. That's a fact.
Well, we're going to have a look at the data here and also the basic physics, and we'll find when we do that the CO2 scare story doesn't add up.
If emissions keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. The planet's on f***ing fire.
First off, the headline stuff. Climate alarmists say the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere might be small, but it's higher than it's been for tens of thousands of years. That's absolutely true. For much of the past 100,000 years, the Earth has been in the depths of an ice age, a terrifying glacial maximum, when much of the world as we know it was buried under ice. CO2 levels sank to just 180 parts per million. If it sunk a little further, all the plants would have died and all life on Earth would have come to an end. Happily, CO2 levels have recovered a bit. But where are they in the big picture? Are they abnormally high? By looking at plant fossils and ancient sedimentary rocks and other stuff, scientists can reconstruct how much CO2 was in the Earth's atmosphere over the past 500 million years. Here's one study published in Nature. This is the last 400 million years. It goes up and down quite a bit. Where are we? Right down here. Let's go back further, almost 600 million years. Here's a big study published in the American Journal of Science. CO2 levels reaching 8,000 parts per million here. Where are we? Way, way down here. Despite the best efforts of you and your Chevy Silverado, current CO2 levels are still close to being as low as they've ever been in 500 million years. How about since the Industrial Revolution? It's interesting to read the IPCC's own words, since after all it's the main cheerleader for the climate alarm. In its fourth assessment report, it's surprisingly circumspect. Most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely to be due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Only most, and only since the mid-20th century. Then in its fifth big report it says, it is extremely likely that more than half of the observed increase in global average surface temperature from 1951 was caused by the anthropogenic increase in greenhouse gas concentrations and other anthropogenic forcings together. The wording of these key official statements is very important and revealing. It's a much more modest, nervous claim, and note the timescales since the mid-20th century, from 1951. What happened to the Industrial Revolution? To see why the IPCC starts in 1950, let's look at what CO2 levels were like before then. Here's the record from NOAA of annual changes in atmospheric CO2 since 1850, taken from ice core readings in Antarctica. Before the 1950s, CO2 levels rose and fell, increasing and decreasing from year to year. Whatever trend there might have been is hard to spot. It's only after 1950 that CO2 levels clearly start to climb. Here's another graph from Scripps, illustrating the same thing. Before 1950, CO2 concentrations are bouncing around a lot. There is in fact a slight upward trend, but so weak it's hard to notice. It's only after 1950 that there's a clear upward trend in CO2. This is why the IPCC specifically refers to man-made global warming happening since the mid-20th century, and from 1951. The world has indeed been gently warming, but did it start in the 1950s? Let's look at temperature change over the last 2,000 years. Here's a well-respected study published in Nature. Here's another, published in the journal Physical Geography. Here we have the medieval warm period. Here, the very cold Little Ice Age. According to many studies, the coldest it's been in the last 10,000 years. And here, the recovery from the Little Ice Age. It's clear from these and other studies like them that the current warming began 300 to 400 years ago, long before the mid-20th century. CO2 cannot possibly explain the cause. And how about more recently? Here's the official US record published by the government and the National Climate Assessment of the warmest temperatures in the US in the 20th century. Here's the period with lower CO2, with more warm spells and heat waves. Here's the period with rising CO2, with fewer heat spells and heat waves.
I brought the graph, right?
The graph of 20th century temperatures that climate alarmists like to use is largely based on urban and suburban thermometer readings, which have been skewed by what's known as urban heat bias. Now, it's well known that urban areas show far more warming. To quote from one study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, there is consistent evidence that urban stations have a systematic bias relative to rural stations. We've got into detail about this in another film, but briefly, here's a temperature record of the past century from urban Tokyo, with temperatures rising. And here's one from nearby rural Hakijima Island, showing little or no warming. The simplest way of correcting for urban heat bias is to look at rural temperatures only. When we do this, what do we find? Let's look at, say, Brazil. There are only 6 temperature reading stations in Brazil, stretching back to the early 20th century. 5 are urban and 1 rural. Only 2 of the 5 urban stations show any marked increase in temperature of the last century. This is Sao Paulo at the start of the 20th century, and here it is now. How about the rural station? This is a picture of Quixamabim, and this is what its temperature record tells us. Hot temperatures in the 1930s and 40s, a fall to the 1970s, a recovery after that, but temperatures are still lower than they were in the 1940s. This is happening all over the world. Here's the rural temperature for China. A rise up to the 1940s, then a decline for a few decades, then a recovery. Likewise for America, same pattern. Remember what the IPCC said. It is likely that more than half of the observed increase in temperature from 1951 was due to greenhouse gases. According to these studies, that's more than half of little or nothing. The whole CO2 story doesn't add up. All of these figures and studies you can look up for yourself, by the way. But the physics. It's basic physics, they say. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, therefore more CO2 will mean higher temperatures. Let's look at what we know from basic atmospheric physics. The greenhouse effect is just one part of Earth's complex climate system. Greenhouse gases make up just 0.1% of the atmosphere, and of those greenhouse gases, water vapor is by far the most important, accounting for about 97% of the greenhouse effect. CO2 is one of more of a dozen others. So what do we know about these gases and how they behave? Time for a little history. The Convair B-58 Hustler, one of a number of supersonic planes used by the US to defend us all from the threat of communism. The US military needed to ensure these planes could do their stuff properly at high altitude, which is harder than you'd think. To do this, they needed to understand how atmospheric gases behaved. Cue US Air Force research in Cambridge, England, and elsewhere. The data they gathered then and since is collected in HITRAM, or the High Resolution Transmission Molecular Absorption Database, catchy. Well, we know from HITRAM the different gases are better at absorbing infrared radiation at different wavelengths. CO2 is especially good at absorbing it at a wavelength of 15 microns. A micron is a millionth of a meter. This is where it really does its stuff as a greenhouse gas. But what we also know is that at the center of this 15 micron band, at a certain point, CO2 becomes saturated. It's absorbed about as much infrared radiation as it's going to. Adding more CO2 can help absorb a bit more, but each additional bit of CO2 becomes less and less effective as a greenhouse gas. This, for example, from a paper in Nature. As atmospheric CO2 concentrations increase, the radiative forcing per unit CO2 emitted will become smaller, because the strongest absorption bands will be already saturated. And here's a graph to show what happens. When CO2 is just 100 parts per million of the atmosphere, it's going great guns. It has its biggest effect as a greenhouse gas. But by the time it reaches 200 parts per million, its greenhouse properties have halved. And as CO2 levels rise after that, its effect keeps shrinking. At the level it is now, its effect as a greenhouse gas is extremely weak. How do the climate alarmists get round this? They argue 2 things. First, another bit of physics. Higher in the atmosphere, at lower pressure, the 15 micron wavelength broadens, and it is theorized that CO2 might be able to absorb a little more infrared radiation at the edges. If this were happening in any significant way and having anything more than a marginal effect, then we should see a distinct warming signal higher in the atmosphere. Remember that. warming higher in the atmosphere. The second thing they argue is this. They concede that by itself CO2 could never produce enough warming for their silly predictions to stand up. So, they say, a little warming from CO2 will cause the oceans to emit more water vapor, which is a far more important gas than CO2, remember. Now, if this were happening, once again, we would expect to see a marked warming signal higher in the atmosphere. Why? Because as the surface air becomes warmer and more moist, it becomes more buoyant, rising higher into the atmosphere where it condenses and releases heat. And it should be especially noticeable over the hot, wet tropics, in the so-called troposphere. That's what the theory says, that's what the physics says, that's what all the climate models say. Hurrah! Now we have something to look out for, something to test. Imagine the Earth flattened out. Here's the South Pole, here's the North Pole, here's the tropics. And here, above the Earth, is the atmosphere, or a heat map of the atmosphere as it's supposed to look according to climate models. See that big hot red spot in the troposphere? This has been called the signature or fingerprint of greenhouse gas warming, the smoking gun. How much should it have been warming here? Here are the predictions of 39 official climate models, produced at great expense to the taxpayer. What's the average predicted rise in temperature at the hotspot? This line here. According to climate theory, we should see 0.42 of a degree Celsius warming per decade. Well, since the 1980s, we've had satellites measuring temperatures in the atmosphere, and what have they found? A miserable 0.17 degrees. For the theory of CO2-led warming to be correct, there should have been 2.5 times as much warming in this key spot as has taken place. This disproof of CO2-led global warming has been highlighted repeatedly by Professor John Christie, one of the world's foremost climate scientists, and has been confirmed yet again by a recent study of temperature change in the troposphere and stratosphere published in the Journal of Atmospheric and Solar Terrestrial Physics. Our analysis did not show a consistent warming with gradual increase from low to high latitudes in both hemispheres, as it should be from global warming theory. As a result, the authors say, it is not possible to reliably support the view of the presence of global warming, in the sense of an enhanced greenhouse effect due to human activities. But how about the water vapor? Remember the water vapor? What did they find? In observations, this increase in atmospheric water vapor has not happened. Oh dear. Not only has it not happened, it hasn't happened, they say, for 4 decades. That's since the 1980s. But surely we know from Al Gore's famous movie that there's a strong correlation between CO2 levels and temperatures. Let's remind ourselves.
The relationship is actually very complicated, but when there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between CO2 and temperature is complicated. Why did he feel the need to say that? He's so confident in his other assertions. Why did he inject that rather strange line, "It's complicated"? I'll tell you why. The changes are in the wrong order. Temperatures rise, then a few hundred years later, CO2 rises, and vice versa. This is because the biggest source of CO2 on the planet is the oceans, which put out CO2 when they warm and suck it back in when they cool. Al Gore would have known this if he had read any basic textbook on climate science. The oceans are a great reservoir of CO2, holding about 27 times as much of it as the atmosphere. The oceans tend to give off CO2 when they are warm and dissolve more when they're cold. Because oceans are so big and deep, they take hundreds of years to warm up and cool down, hence the lag between changes in temperature and CO2 levels. Naughty Al Gore. That's more than a complication. That's Gore either being worryingly ignorant of basic climate science or willfully misrepresenting data in order to mislead us. And it's doubly disturbing that no scientists called him out on this. How about the relationship between CO2 and temperature on shorter timescales? What was happening before the Industrial Revolution? From about 8,000 years ago till the start of the 19th century, this is what CO2 was doing. It was rising, not because of cars and planes and stuff, because they hadn't been invented. It was changing naturally without any help from us. But as CO2 was rising, what were temperatures doing? We can see from proxy measurements taken from the bed of the Pacific Ocean. Oh no, they're going down. CO2 and temperature are going in the opposite direction for about 8,000 years. This is known, politely in the scientific literature, as the Holocene conundrum. The Earth's climate system is enormously complex, but there is mounting, compelling evidence that by far the biggest cause of climatic variation on Earth is the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth. as a result both of variations in solar activity and changing volumes of cloud cover on Earth. In short, the sun and the clouds. Here's a record of rural temperature variation in the northern hemisphere over the past century. And here's the best fit for CO2. But here's the same graph matched with variations in solar activity over the past century. And here's almost 200 years of rural temperature records in China. And here's changes in solar activity in the same period. Fits like a glove. And how about clouds? Clouds have an enormous impact on temperatures. We all know this from the simplest everyday observations. When it's cloudy, it's cold. Recent work on the relationship of cosmic radiation and clouds suggests that there should be an inverse relationship between solar activity and cloud cover. The more active the sun, the fewer clouds we're likely to get. And indeed, that is what we find. Here is a proxy record of global cloud coverage over the past 500 years, published last year in Nature. If we look at the last 120 years, we see that global cloud coverage is more or less an exact mirror image of solar activity. Clearly, the sun and clouds are acting in concert, and the feeble effects of CO2 are nowhere to be seen. To any normal person living in the real world, it seems pretty obvious that, if you want to understand climate, it might help to look at the sun and clouds. Slowly, grudgingly, science journals are finding it unavoidable. A study published in Nature last year found an unusually significant correlation between solar variation and sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic. A study published in Science last year found that temperature change in the past 2 decades was not associated with rising greenhouse gases, but was caused largely by reduced cloud cover. A study in the International Journal of Climatology finds that cloudiness is the most important meteorological factor shaping the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth's surface, and in turn, the related increase in air temperature. And just to slay some other myths, climate alarmists tell us to look at Venus, where 97% of the atmosphere is CO2, and the temperature is 460 degrees. They don't mention that Mars has the same proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere, but is a perishing minus 46 degrees Celsius. Venus is hotter because it's closer to the sun. Mars is colder because it's further away. And how about linking rising CO2 with extreme weather events, which some deranged and perhaps cynical climate scientists are willing to do?
Troubling signs of climate change are natural disasters like floods, deadly heat waves, and tornadoes.
Higher highs, lower lows, more flooding.
Over the past century, there has been no increase in the number and severity of storms and hurricanes, no increase in drought. There's actually been a very marked decrease in wildfires, and so on. We cover all this on our other films. Anyone who says that CO2-led climate change is a well-established, indisputable fact is either a fool or a liar. Basic physics does not support the claim. Observations flatly contradict it. But this is a theory on which too much is riding. It can't be allowed to fall down. There's too much money at stake, too many reputations. Hundreds of thousands of climate jobs depend on this being true. The climate industry cannot allow their theory to die. And so they will argue that black is white, and they will turn in fury on anyone who dares to challenge it. Too much CO2, my ass. The exact opposite is the truth. What should worry us is not that CO2 levels in the atmosphere are too high, but that they are still far, far too low. CO2 is plant food. By the standard of the past 500 million years, we are in a period which has been described as a CO2 famine. The story we're told about the demon gas CO2 is lie upon lie upon lie, an offense against science and also against democracy, since these lies are being used to push through the most radical political agenda. Don't trust what you're told. Check the data and the science yourself. My name is Martin Durkin. This is Guerrilla Science.